All right. I'm Jamie Dunn, and I'm a genealogy librarian here at the Indiana State Library, and I'm going to be talking today about From Cradle to Coffin, Vital Records Research in Indiana. And I'm going to talk about where to find birth and death information, especially looking at resources other than birth or death certificates, and where to find information about your ancestors' births and deaths. And the information I'm presenting on is specific to Indiana, but most of what I'm going to talk about holds true for other states as well. And with this presentation, I have posted a handout with links and resources that I talk about today, so you'll be able to access all of the resources that I mentioned throughout the presentation. So first off, what are vital records? They are documents that record what are called vital statistics. So basically birth and death information about an individual, about your ancestors. And they may also contain other details about an individual, such as birth date, death date, place of birth, place of death, parents' names, and all sorts of other biographical details about an individual. So vital records are a really great resource for genealogy because they tend to contain so much information in one place. And so where do vital records come from? They are often created by the government, public records, created by the federal government, the state government, the local government. There are also non-governmental records of a vital nature. They are created by organizations, corporations, religious groups, various groups like that. And so there are sometimes in vital record research some common problems that you can encounter. Sometimes availability is an issue. For the date range you need, the sort of record you want may not exist, or the records may be damaged due to age or due to a fire or a flood or some sort of disaster at the record-keeping facility. Another issue can be accessibility. The records you need may be closed to you by law due to privacy protections. The archive that keeps the records might not be close to you, might not be convenient for you to access. The records might not be indexed, so if you don't know exactly what you're looking for, it might be hard to get into the records because there's just too many of them. Or the records might not be online or easily accessible that way. Sometimes tracking down these historic records is just not easy. And then sometimes you can find a record and it will have errors in it. The information could be wrong, or there could just be no information. Part of the record could be blank. So we're going to start out looking at birth and death certificates, and these are issued by the county in which the person born or died, and the original use of birth and death certificates is to prove identity and to document life events. And the certificate dates vary state to state. In most states, they started keeping birth and death certificates sometime between 1880 and 1910. And in Indiana specifically, they started keeping birth and death certificates in 1882, and those records are located in the county health department in each of the individual counties. And from 1882 to 1907 in Indiana, birth and death certificates were optional. So not everyone chose to get a birth or a death certificate for their family member. So if you're looking for these records, they can be kind of hit or miss. From 1907 on, the records were mandatory under state law, and birth and death certificates were filed with the county health department as well as the Indiana State Department of Health in Indianapolis. And even after 1907, not everyone chose to comply with the law, but as you get more and more into recent times, you see a lot more. They estimate by the mid-1920s, everyone was getting their records the way they should be. And birth and death certificates can tell us huge amounts of information about the individuals we're researching, and that information usually comes from the family of the person listed on the record, although sometimes it might come from an employer or from an employee of the hospital, the nursing home, the medical facility in question. So how do you get birth and death certificates? You can get them from the county health department where the birth or death occurred, from the Indiana State Department of Health if it took place after 1907, or most recently, Ancestry.com partnered with the Indiana Records Administration and Archives to put the birth and death records for Indiana online, and you can get those through Ancestry.com, or if you have if your local library has an Ancestry Library Edition subscription, you can get them there as well, and that covers births 1907 to 1940 and deaths 1899 to 2011, and those are full scanned images of the original records as they actually appear at the county. So that's a really great resource to be able to acquire a lot of birth and death certificates for your ancestors in one research session. So locating birth and death certificates can be a little bit of a trick if you don't know where exactly your person was born or died, or when they were born or died. And so with that new Ancestry database, that is a good place to look. Another good place to look for birth and death certificate information, if you're not exactly sure what you're looking for, are indexes and other online databases. These are print indexes as well. A major source for Indiana is the WPA indexes. They are a set of books created by the Works Progress Administration between about 1938 and 1940, and they index birth, death, and marriage records for Indiana. The births and deaths cover 1882 to 1920. The downside to the Works Progress Administration indexes is that they only covered 2/3 of the counties before World War II took place and the project was dismantled to move resources to the war effort. So for the other third of Indiana counties, there just isn't an index, unfortunately. But to some degree, there are also indexes that have been done by local genealogical or historical societies, and you can find those online. Sometimes they're in a database form, sometimes they're in a book you can purchase. They also are held by a lot of genealogical libraries, and so you can access that information that way to help figure out where exactly the person you're researching might have been. So, starting with birth certificates, just going to look at how a birth certificate is laid out, the sort of information you can find. And so the first part of a birth certificate covers the child, and so you're going to get information on them, where they're born, their name, their gender, their birth date, whether it was a legitimate birth, whether it was a multiple birth. And so just a little bit of biographical information about the child. The next page covers the parents. The father and the mother, you're going to get their name, their residence, their ages, their race, the parents' birthplace, parents' occupations, and how many children the mother has had before this child, which that particular piece of information can be really helpful if you suddenly found that you thought this mother had 2 children, and then the birth certificate says there's 4. It tells you that there's more children you need to look for, and so that can help further your research. And then the bottom section of the birth certificate is information from the doctor or the midwife. And so you're going to get the birth date again, as well as the exact time of birth. And sometimes there may be other medical notes related to the child or anything that might have happened during the birth process, just depending on what was up with this particular birth. So that's something to look at that might be of interest as well. And then for a death certificate, the first section covers geography. You get where the person died. If they died in a city or town, they're going to name that. If they died in a rural area, you're probably going to get the name of the township and the county. If they died at a hospital or a nursing home or other sort of facility, you'll usually get that information. You'll also get the usual or regular address of the decedent. So if a person died in a hospital, you're going to get where they usually lived, so their address. And then in this section, you're going to find the name of the deceased. The next section covers the decedent, so you're going to get all the biographical details, their gender, their race, their marital status, spouse's name, date of birth, place of birth, parents' names, parents' place of birth, decedent's occupation, the name of the informant, and on the earlier death certificates, it just gives you the name of the informant, the person who gave the information for the death certificate. Later death certificates, you get the relationship between the informant and the decedent, and that can be useful because a lot of times the closer the relationship between the two people, the more likely the information on the death certificate is to be correct. So if the informant is a spouse or a parent or a child, a lot of times you can trust that information more than if it's a doctor or a social worker or an employer giving the information. So that's just something to consider in all that is, where did this information come from? Because just because the death certificate is a piece of government-issued documentation doesn't necessarily mean the information is correct, because it had to come from somewhere. The next section on the death certificate covers the cause of death and all the medical things. This is where you get the date of death, the exact time of death, the cause of death, any contributing causes, how long the person was under a doctor's care and was suffering from an illness, if that is relevant to why they died. Also, the name of the doctor that was providing care to this person. And sometimes you can kind of use the information on the death certificate to make some inferences about what might have been going on. For example, on this death certificate pictured, the cause of death is paralysis, and the contributory things include high blood pressure. So it's entirely possible that this woman had a stroke. Could be something else, but just something to think about from the medical side of things if you're looking at death certificates for family medical history purposes. And then the final section on the death certificate covers the funeral and burial information. So you're going to get the name of the cemetery, the date of the burial, the name of the funeral home / undertaker, and what kind of funeral services were performed. Was the body embalmed, cremated, that sort of thing. And that information can be useful if you want to track down funeral or cemetery records, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. So next, a really useful source for vital records can be the US Federal Census. The Federal Census was taken every 10 years starting in 1790, and Indiana does not actually appear in the Federal Census until 1820 because we weren't a state until 1816, which was between census years. So the 1790, 1800, and 1810 censuses don't cover Indiana. And the census provides demographic information on the population of the United States. And sometimes you will see references to state censuses. There were several states that conducted their own censuses, usually in years that ended in 5. And a lot of other states, their censuses would have as much detail as the federal census. But Indiana state censuses, which you will sometimes see references to online, are generally not that detailed. A lot of them don't even name individual people. They just say there were so many thousand people living in this county and so many thousand people living in that county. So not genealogically useful information. The few state censuses that do actually name names and give you good information on individuals are not complete. Most of the state census records were released back to the counties to keep their own records, and there was no requirement that they keep them, so not all of them did. So Indiana state censuses are not usually a good source of genealogical information. And the censuses, the information you're going to get varies by decade. 1790 to 1840, the censuses start, they just list the name of the head of the household of each individual household. So the vast majority of the entries are men. Occasionally there'll be a woman who was the head of her own household, usually a widow, but for the most part you're going to get men, and men who were of age and therefore not living in a parent or brother's household. And as far as any sort of vital information or even demographic information in general, all you get are age ranges by gender. So all the males who are between 0 and 10 years old, all the males that are between 10 and 16-year-olds, and so on, and the same age groupings for the women. You don't get any information on the birthplace, you don't get an exact year of birth, anything like that. So before 1840, the censuses are not really a good source for vital records research. From 1850 forward, it's a lot better of a source for demographic and biographic and vital records information. You get the name of every single person in a household, all the adults, all the children, everyone. And you get the actual ages of everyone in the household and where that person was born. So a little bit more information than you got in the past. Not full vital records, but better than it was. I've left off here the 1900 census is kind of a special thing. It provides the month and year of birth for each individual. So that's really helpful. That's the most information you get as far as date of birth on the censuses. You also get, on the 1900 and certain other censuses, the state or country of birth of a person's parents, as well as the person themselves. So that's a useful source of information that you don't get every time, but they just kind of varied by census what they asked for, and unfortunately didn't always ask for the best details every time. But another part of the census that is less commonly looked at by researchers are the census mortality schedules. And these are part of the federal census. They were conducted in 1850, 60, 70, and 80. And they document all the people who died in each township of each county of each state during the census year. And the census year doesn't follow the calendar year. The census year is, for example, the 1850 census year is June 1st, 1849 to May 31st, 1850. And it follows the same month pattern for the other decades as well. And so these records just cover, they were originally created for statistical information about causes of death, ages of death. The federal government just wanted some statistics on how old people were living, what they died from, things like that. And so this was just a good little snapshot of what was going on in the states. And so not every state has their mortality schedules online. The Census Bureau turned these records back over to the states at some point. And so some states have digitized theirs through Ancestry, some have digitized theirs through Family Search, some have put theirs on their own digital collections. The Indiana mortality schedules are available as full-color scans of the original records through the Indiana State Library digital collections. So just in looking at a mortality schedule, this is an example of the Indiana mortality schedule from 1880. And there is a lot of good information here. From left to right, you get the name of the deceased, their age, their gender, their race, marital status, their birthplace, parents' birthplace, their job, their month of death, their cause of death, how long they lived, where they lived, and the name of the doctor who was involved in their care. So a lot of good information, practically as good as a death certificate. And the mortality schedules all cover the pre-death certificate era in Indiana. So a really good source for vital records information. Just unfortunately, they don't cover all the years, just that little snapshot from each decade. So it's too bad they didn't do those for the entire decade. It would have been great information. So the next record source we're going to look at are coroner's inquests, and these specifically cover suspicious deaths or cases where the death might need to result in criminal proceedings against someone. If you've ever watched any of the crime shows on TV, there's usually a scene where they go to the morgue and they're talking to the medical examiner and they want to know, okay, doc, how did this person die? What was going on here? And it's that sort of thing. The coroner or medical examiner for the county would have done an autopsy, and would have determined how these individuals died. And in this example from Monroe County, you can see some of the deaths were determined to be natural. Some of them were these mostly accidents and suicides here. Sometimes they'll find that criminal activity did take place. The person at the bottom of the list is apparently suffering from a natural pneumonia. Don't really know how that works, but that's what the doctor found. And so these records generally, you don't get access to the original records for a coroner's inquest. They might be located at the county courthouse, the county health department, the local police offices, the local medical examiner's office. I've tried to look for retention policies for coroner's records. There don't really seem to be any, so I suspect some of these records have been destroyed over the years. But at least for Indiana, a good number of coroner's inquests have been indexed or abstracted, and you can find these index and abstract books at a lot of your local genealogical libraries, your local public libraries. So the record sets are out there, at least in partial form. So you can get a hold of this information and find vital information about the death that way. Next, we're going to look at the Social Security records are a great source of information in genealogy. They provide information about deceased individuals who had a Social Security number. The federal government started issuing Social Security numbers in the mid-1930s, and in the early days of when Social Security started, not everyone had to have a number. If you had already retired before Social Security became a thing, you didn't need a Social Security number because you probably weren't going to get a payout. And some women who never worked never had to get a Social Security number because they never paid in. So in the early days, the numbers can be hit or miss in terms of what records are available. As time went on, eventually everyone had a Social Security number. So the Social Security records, at least the index form, is available several different places on the web. It's available through Family Search for free. I usually access it through Ancestry Library Edition. I find their interface the easiest to use, and they actually have 2 Social Security databases. And the Social Security records are embargoed for 3 years by federal law. The whole point of releasing Social Security numbers once someone passed away was to help prevent identity theft by making the number public record so it couldn't be used illegally or for sketchy activities. But they give that 3-year embargo to allow time for estates to be closed and final legal and paperwork things to be handled in the case of a decedent, so that just everything can be taken care of the way it needs to be. But on Ancestry, like I said, there are 2 parts, 2 different Social Security indexes they have on there. The first, as illustrated on the left, is the U.S. Social Security Death Index, which covers 1935 to 2014, and it provides just a snippet of information. You get the person's name, their last residence, which is not necessarily where they actually lived at the end of their life, but where their checks were being sent. And also you get the birth date, the death date, and when and where their Social Security number was issued. Now, the other database is the U.S. Social Security Applications and Claims Index, which covers 1936 to 2007. And nowadays, when a baby is born, they get their Social Security number fairly quickly after that. And so the application process is fairly short. But when Social Security first became a thing, you would have to apply. A lot of people had to apply as adults, and so they had to prove their identity. They had to provide background information on themselves. And so you get this lovely long listing of information on a person, as you can see on the right-hand side there. You get their name, the gender, the race, birth date, birthplace, information about their parents, the actual Social Security number. And where the Social Security applications come in particularly useful is if you're researching a female ancestor, because historically, every time a woman got married, her name would change, and that can make her hard to trace throughout her life. But every time that she would change her name, she would have to file that with Social Security. So you're going to find in that notes section every change of name on a person. So therefore that tells you that's a marriage record I can look for, and that's a name to look for her under. So that has proved really useful in research, just being able to track all those name changes. And if you want someone's full Social Security record application, if the person is dead, you can get their record from the Social Security Administration. It's kind of expensive and there's a long wait, but you can get the original application as they hand wrote it or typed it. You can get a copy of that. And so depending on what you're looking for on the individual you're researching, that can be a good place to go for more information on some of those elusive people. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about newspapers, which are another great source for vital records information and for genealogy in general. Newspapers really cover local information well, and especially if you're looking at some of the older newspapers for rural areas or more small towns, there's not always a lot going on in the way of news or events. So they talk about their neighbors and the local gossip. So you can find all sorts of really entertaining details on your ancestors and the people you're researching. And so newspapers are just great for that. And nowadays they're digitizing a lot of newspapers and putting them online in databases that you can search the keywords for. So it's a lot, you don't have to sit there with the microfilm like you used to. You can find a lot more information just by searching for the names of people. And so the first sort of newspaper articles that you can look at are newspaper announcements. And these were used to convey local information briefly. They were particularly common before 1900, and sometimes they're humorously brief. I once saw one that said, "Mrs. Smith died Tuesday." That's it. That was the entire article. And so you just kind of had to hope there wasn't more than one ailing Mrs. Smith in the same time period. And then you had to look at a calendar for like 1873 to figure out when Tuesday was. So they have a limited use, these newspaper announcements, but as you can see, these examples I put in the PowerPoint are pretty indicative of the information you're going to get. And so it's just a brief little snippet, but especially if you have someone where you don't know their exact birth date, their exact death date, or maybe exactly where they lived, you can take this information from the newspaper and use it to track down more detailed records elsewhere. The next sort of information that you can get from newspapers are the vital records columns, and these are also used for specifically local information. The vital records columns are more commonly found in newspapers from cities and larger towns, particularly places that had their own hospital within the city limits, because a lot of times the newspaper was getting the information directly from the hospital. These were started pre-HIPAA, pre our modern ideas about privacy, and so nobody thought anything of putting these things in the newspaper for everyone to see. And so, as you can see in this example from Terre Haute, you've got your births, you've got the name of the mom, the name of the dad, where they lived, the name and gender of the child. With deaths, you actually get not just the names of the people who died and how old they were, but what they died from and where they lived. And a lot of times in modern newspapers, they still run the birth column. They don't give you the name of the child anymore, but they'll run the names of parents, or at least the last names of parents, and the gender of the child and which hospital. They don't really run the deaths columns anymore. Those have been phased out mostly due to privacy laws. And the most common source for records that people look for in newspapers are obituaries. And obituaries didn't really become popular until about 1900. Prior to that, someone who was famous or significant in some way might get an obituary, but they didn't really tend to run them for just your average Joe. So the obituary recaps a person's life, tells about their familial and social connection, and also conveys information about their funeral, the burial, and will often provide other little details. Older obituaries tend to also tell what people died from, the more modern ones don't. And obituaries are one source that you're going to find in your more modern newspapers. They still run obituaries today, so these are still a really good source for if you're doing more modern research. And so the next thing are news articles, and news articles are really the entire point of a newspaper, and yet they're the part of the newspaper that people are least likely to look at for genealogical information. And so these are your human interest stories, your local news, your national news, your state news, your crime stories, anything in the paper. They often have familial details. And for example, looking at these news articles, you can see that on the left-hand side, you've got one with birth information that this pioneer couple had 10 children, which for the time period is not all that unusual, but all 10 of them lived to adulthood. And so that is quite remarkable. And so the local paper wrote about it. And the rest of the article goes on. It names the parents, it names the children, it names the children's spouses. Loads of great information in this article. And on the other hand, it's the most brutal murder in the history of the county. And sometimes the crime stories, people don't want to think about that, but the victims of a murder, the perpetrators of a murder are all related to someone. And so even in these sad, graphic stories, you can find genealogical information about people. And, for example, these two gentlemen were murdered. And so right here, you've got the day they died, you've got their cause of death, and you've got just different information on the trial and the grand jury and things, all that you can find in the newspaper. And it's just another source to look for your ancestors. And another source for vital records, particularly in the pre-birth and death certificate days, are the religious records. Most religious groups, or many religious groups really, kept some sort of record of the births and deaths of their members. However, not all of these groups make their records available to researchers. These are private organizations, and they're not obligated to make their records available to researchers or to people outside of their religious group. And so a lot of times these religious records are kept at the local level. They're kept at the local church or wherever they might be. Sometimes they will be sent to a regional or national archive for that religious group, just depending on what each individual group's policies are. So if you know your ancestors had a specific religious affiliation, you can try to figure out what, for example, churches might be in the area where they lived of that type of group. Or you can try to figure out where, if there's an archives for that group, and see if you can figure out where those records are to try to trace the information. And some religious groups have made their records, some have made them available to be microfilmed, and so you can find the records in places. Others have allowed abstracts or indexes to be made, like this example of Quaker records from Wayne County. And as you can see, you've got all these birth and death information on entire families just all laid out from these records. And so this is really helpful for the pre-birth and death certificate era. And at least in the United States, the farther back you go in time, the more likely it is that people had some sort of religious affiliation. So even if the people you're looking are not so religious in modern times, you may be able to find information from the past about ancestors, just depending on what's out there. And so another source is funeral home records. And most, if not all, funeral homes keep some sort of record of the services they perform. And these records usually go back to the establishment of the funeral home. Funeral homes are pretty good at keeping everything. And so if you know from, say, the death certificate or the obituary, the name of the funeral home that performed the funeral for an individual, you can try to go to that funeral home and see if they will share their records with you, which once again, these are private businesses. They are not obligated to share their records, but a lot of them will, particularly if you have a good idea of the date range you're looking at. And so, as you can see from this example here, which is fairly typical for funeral home records, it's quite detailed in terms of the biographical information on the individuals listed. And some funeral home records are even more detailed to the point where you'll see the sort of casket that was purchased and the hymns that were sung at the funeral and who gave the eulogy and things like that. So you get a lot of the details that you don't necessarily find in the government records that way. And a common question that we get here at the State Library is, what happens to the funeral records of a funeral home that closed down? And unfortunately, there's not a set policy because these are records from a private corporation or institution. They're not obligated to ship them somewhere. So sometimes the records go home with the owner if, say, the owner's retiring and no one wants to buy the business. Sometimes they just toss them in the dumpster when they're cleaning out. Sometimes they'll end up at a local library or historical society, which is how we've acquired copies of some of the records. So it really just varies. So that's just something to think about, is older funeral homes, the records may unfortunately no longer be with us. And cemetery records tend to contain a lot of the same information as the funeral records. They contain information about anybody who's buried in a given cemetery. Some of the records are really, really detailed to the point where you could practically write a biographical sketch off of them. And others are just going to give you a name and the plot number. It really just varies by cemetery. And cemeteries are also not usually considered to be public record, so you may or may not be able to get a hold of them, just depending on the policy of each individual cemetery. Cemeteries that are still actively accepting new burials often still have their own records. Cemeteries that have closed, or older cemeteries, or little family plots that are off on the side of a cornfield somewhere, there may have never been records. They may have no longer kept the records. So just depending on where an individual is buried really affects where you're going to find the records at. So if you're trying to track down cemetery records, you may be able to, you may not be able to. And you can actually, though, find in a lot of genealogy libraries indexes to cemetery records, and there's two different kinds of indexes for cemeteries. The first kind, the most common kind, is when an individual or a group of people went out to a cemetery and walked up and down and wrote down everything they saw in the cemetery and made a book out of it. And a lot of times these are done by DAR groups, SAR groups, Boy Scouts. So you have those, and that's just recording the actual tombstones that are in the cemetery on a given date. So if a tombstone has been vandalized or fallen apart or just sort of worked its way under the soil over the years, that record is not going to show up, because if they can't see it, they can't write it down. The other kind of indexes the actual cemetery record books or record cards from the cemetery office. And so those are more likely to cover everyone who's ever been buried in the cemetery, unless the cemetery just didn't keep good records. And so a lot of times you can find those in your genealogy libraries or in your local libraries if you're searching for a local cemetery. And so this is an example of a cemetery record done by the DAR from cemeteries in Union County. And this is an index where they walked the cemetery and wrote down what they read on the stones. So, and then they put it in alphabetical order for ease of use. So, you know, some stones are more detailed than others. And another good source for cemetery records is you can go on Find a Grave or Billion Graves. These are both free websites. And I've got the example here of the same person in both, just to show you what they both look like. But if you're trying to find someone, I recommend searching both of these sites, because There's some people that are listed in one but not the other. So a lot of times with Find a Grave, and these are completely free, you can search them, but a lot of times you're going to get a picture of the tombstone, and you might get additional information that someone added. Sometimes people have added a photograph of the person if they own one, or a copy of the obituary, or any notes they might have on the person. They're going to link up the people's spouses and sometimes their children or parents. So these are just sort of an online database version of a cemetery index, and a really helpful way to be able to research, particularly if you don't live close to the cemeteries where your ancestors were buried. And so just in looking at this, another thing that you can kind of, people overlook as being a cemetery record are the tombstones themselves. Have good information on them. They have the person's name. You're going to at least generally get the year of birth and the year of death. Sometimes you get more information. I've seen military service listed, particularly if you're looking at someone who was buried in a national cemetery. Sometimes I've seen ones that list the marriage date for a couple, just different information like that. So the stones themselves are a record and a perfect source for vital records information. And also sometimes based on the stones that you're looking at, you can kind of make some inferences and educated guesses. This is a prime example. You've got two gravestones in a cemetery side by side, and one says, daughter of E.A. and G.B. Vaughn, died March 21st, 1868, and the other says, Elizabeth Ann, wife of G.B. Vaughn, died March 23rd, 1868. So, based on these two stones, their proximity to each other, we can draw some conclusions about this. And so, most likely, this is a situation where the wife and daughter of G.B. Vaughn, it was mother and baby died in childbirth, died shortly after childbirth. There's a chance that some sort of illness swept through and killed both of them, but given the time period, childbirth is the most likely cause of death here. And so sometimes you can kind of figure things out about people from the cemetery just by looking at what is going on with the physical placement of the stones. And then, my favorite tombstone ever, sometimes you get super lucky, and this unfortunate David Eubank had a tree fall on him when he was 23, and his parents decided that that needed to be documented on his tombstone for posterity. So sometimes you get the cause of death on the tombstone, and it's great. And so I just had to throw this in here because how often does this happen? And then sometimes, just a side note on cemetery records, because I did not know that you could do this until recently, and it blew my mind. Sometimes you're going to get a tombstone that lists a date of death and the age of the decedent. So he's so many years old, so many months old, so many days old. And then you have to sit there and do the math to try to figure out what their birth date was, and it's hard because every 4 years we've got a leap year, so you've got an extra day, and then not every month has the same number of days either, and it's just really complicated calculations. So there are calculators on the internet that if you have the death date and the age at death, you plug that in and they give you the birth date. And this is a particular calculator from a website called Ancestor Search. I've linked to it in your handout. If you just Google tombstone birth date calculators, you can find tons of them. And so for all those obnoxious tombstones that don't give you the full information, now you can calculate it without having to do all the really hard math, and it's great. So just a few more sources of genealogical and vital records information. These are the more secondary sources, the ones that may not be quite as accurate because they're more removed from actual life events of the individual you're researching, but they can provide really good places for you to start with in your research. If you're not 100% sure what you're looking for, you can get some information here that then you can use to find the actual records that were generated during a person's lifetime. And so history books are really helpful. And if you're researching someone who's more famous or significant in history, you can find them in the traditional history books. But for just your normal common man, You can a lot of times find the information in family history books, as illustrated on the left, or county history books, as illustrated on the right. In the 1880s and 1890s, county histories kind of became a fad. Practically every county in the US, there were these companies that published these history of the county and the people who lived there, and the different families who could submit biographical sketches of family members. And so, since this information is coming from the family, they naturally wanted to make their pioneer ancestors sound amazing. So, you don't always get the complete facts out of these, but like I said, it's just something really good to look at for information. And a lot of these older books are out of copyright and have been digitized. You can get them online for free. I've put some links to some different places in the handout that cover this information. And then finally, a good place to look is family records. And a lot of times family records are held by the family. So if you're researching a more distant relative, you can't always get your hands on these because you don't necessarily know who of your third cousins might have this stuff. But these are things like diaries, letters, other documents, family Bible records as pictured here. And a lot of times, some of this stuff ends up in archives and libraries. Some of it's still held by the family. A lot of times for finding this stuff, just getting onto library catalogs, getting onto Google and searching, you can track down some of this stuff, particularly if you're looking for a less common surname. As far as Bible records go, the Indiana State Library is working on digitizing their Bible record collection and making it available freely on the internet. I've included a link to that in the handout as well. And so just as you can see, there's lots of notes on this family that you can see here and find all kinds of information on all these individuals. And Bible records were especially common in the pre-birth and death certificate era, so definitely something to look at once you get past the late 1880s to find family information. And so that is everything I have on researching from cradle to coffin, the vital records of Indiana. This is the contact information for the genealogy division at the Indiana State Library. I've also included this on the handout, so if you have any questions or would like any help with your research, feel free to contact us. We would love to hear from you, love to be able to help you with your research.